Well, the straight out answer to that is yes, of course, because the Red Bull Honda package now is more competitive than it was in Hungary and Austria. That's thanks mainly to the work that Adrian Newey and his team have done on the performance of the car on medium and high speed corners. It was really, really good around Silverstone. But beyond that, it kind of depends where we are with tyres. Pirelli bringing the hardest range they know to Barcelona. It's going to be incredibly hot, much hotter than we've ever seen for a Spanish Grand Prix in recent times. And beyond that, Barcelona pretty tough on tyres. So if it is a race where everybody's got to run the hard tyre as much as they can for as long as they can, and they run the medium just for a very short stint, it'll be really interesting in qualifying to see what Red Bull might be able to get Mercedes to do. Mercedes will be thinking, so what is it Red Bull are going to pull out of the hat this time? And it may well be that Red Bull go completely conventional on this occasion, trying to do what they can to get Mercedes to maybe run one car on a slightly odd compound in Q2. We'll have to see. Well, it's an interesting one, I think, and this season that will be one of the big talking points and one of the things that'll be most fun to watch about Mercedes, because let's face it, the rest of it is under the heading of they do have a big advantage. So Valtteri versus Lewis is always going to be a talking point. I mentioned in a video a couple of weeks ago that I think in my view Valtteri is driving better this year than ever before, particularly under braking and the way he's coming out of the brakes, and he's not using the brakes quite as much to slow the car into slowish medium speed corners. He's letting the car do a lot of the work. It's really, really nice to watch. There's a good example, the last corner in Austria. But there won't be quite as much scope for that in Barcelona as there was in Silverstone. Barcelona is a circuit that will reward drivers that can turn in on the brakes, for want of a better phrase, can extend the straight, make the corner shorter, and are really, really good at trading off braking against increased cornering load. And the drivers who can do that really well, Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc. So yeah, I mean, it's got to be a really, really good lap for Valtteri to out-qualify Lewis. Again, not impossible, because as we saw last weekend at Silverstone, Lewis Hamilton is not perfect. Surprise. Well, this is another really good question, I think, because we've seen some great races from Charles Leclerc already, 3 indeed, 1 in Austria and then back-to-back, both of them at Silverstone, where he kind of came from nowhere and suddenly there he was on the podium, and we had to say, wow, what an amazing drive. Of course, if you were watching it closely, this was Charles Leclerc at his very, very best. He could talk about the car doing this or the car doing that, magnifying what Sebastian Vettel was saying about the car, but actually watching him on the circuit, he looked absolutely normal. Everything looked perfectly under control. And that is, of course, the epitome of the art. So Charles driving beautifully at both circuits. I think more than most, Barcelona is a circuit that will reward Sebastian Vettel's style of driving, particularly turn 11 or 12, the long right-hander towards the end of the lap. That's a classic Sebastian Vettel corner where he can really get a lot out of the car with his V technique, braking very, very late, making the corner really short, does a nice transition mid-corner. Even if he doesn't have a great back end, he can do it there. It's the camber on the corner works for him. So that's a good corner for him. I think he's pretty good sector 2 as well. Lots of little places where he can get the car nice and straight. So it'd be quite difficult for Charles actually to have any sort of real advantage over Sebastian on one lap of Barcelona. Over a race distance, of course, when other things come into play, the changing track conditions, the tyres going off, tyre deg, blisters, whatever it is, that's when Charles will come into his own relative to Seb. But I think in qualifying, they'll be relatively close. Where will they be? That is the question, because it's much, much more difficult to overtake in Spain than it has been, well, certainly was at Silverstone. So if the Ferraris qualify midfield, and they are capable of qualifying midfield, they're capable of not even getting into Q3 with either car at this stage, it could well be a problem where they're just sitting there waiting to see if they can do something with strategy so they can make up places on the track with an undercut or indeed an overcut. So it could be that sort of weekend for Ferrari. More difficult for Charles to drive the sort of race he did in Silverstone, and with everybody probably running the same sort of strategy, because the tyres will be so limiting in terms of the way you can make the race work at the fastest possible pace, it is going to be quite difficult for them. But having said all of that, they are Ferrari, they do still have a massive budget, they have amazing facilities, and of course they are a pretty good race team with a phenomenal pair of drivers, Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel. Well, you'd have to say Racing Point, particularly as they're still running the brake ducts that the FIA have declared illegal and most of the teams support as being illegal, obviously not Mercedes. So Racing Point, it'll be difficult around Barcelona to see either Lance Stroll or whoever he's driving with, Sergio or Nico, being slow around there. Particularly Lance, he knows that place incredibly well, like everybody else. I mean, there's a bit of a cliche here where you say, oh, well, everybody does all their testing. It's difficult for a driver to find an advantage over anybody or a car to find an advantage because everybody knows the circuit so well. I think at the top level, I don't think that matters that much because I think there's still enough difference, as I say, between a Valtteri and a Lewis and a Charles and a Seb, particularly over race distances. But I think at Racing Point, it really matters that Lance Stroll has done 1,000,000 miles and 1,000,000 laps around Barcelona, because if he's got some rough edges as a driver, whatever that is, still coming to terms with who he is or how good the car is or where his career is going or how much talent he has anyway, all of that will kind of be nullified by going to Barcelona, because how can he be slow around Barcelona in a car as good as a Racing Point? I think that's the real bottom line there. Got to say McLaren, I mean, got this feeling that McLaren should go well there. Obviously, it's a home race for Carlos Sainz, but Lando Norris has looked so good, hasn't he, all year, and not only in race conditions, but also in qualifying. He just looks to be an altogether better driver, and he's pulling it out of the hat as well at the last minute in qualifying, doing really well, not feeling the pressure. So for Carlos Sainz, there is, I've been saying this all year, there's quite a lot of pressure on him from two dimensions now. One, obviously racing at home in Spain, he'd like to be quicker than his teammate at McLaren. And the other, of course, he is the next Ferrari driver. So he needs to start looking good alongside Lando Norris, if only to make the carpet a little bit smoother when he's arriving at Ferrari. It may not be a red carpet, but it'll certainly be a nice carpet that he walks down in Maranello, first day there. As for the others, got to say Pierre Gasly looking very good as a driver, just getting better and better now, isn't he? He's looking really nice in the AlphaTauri Honda. Slight question marks about the reliability and the ability of AlphaTauri to keep that performance level over the course of a race weekend, from qualifying into the race and then during the race for the full distance. So that's a bit of an issue for them. Let's call it the first chicane and going into 3, the exit of 2, and how a driver prepares the car for the entry into 3, because 3 is a long, long corner, regardless of what you do with it. But what you really don't want to do is make it even longer. In other words, come out of 2, get to the middle of the road, see where the apex is, and then do a nice late turn in with a geometrical apex. What you want is very early commitment, very little load going through the car as you're coming out of 2, and just get into 3. And this, of course, is what Lewis and Max and Charles do really well. As I said, the best place to watch there, not that we will be there this year, is from behind turn 2. You can go up on the bank and you see them coming out of 2, and then you get a really good feel for what they're doing going into 3. And I can tell you, there is a massive difference in drivers between the grid, all over the grid. Everybody's different out of there. Nobody is the same as anybody else. And if any corner in the world shows that driving style, for want of a better word, is still there in Formula One, regardless of how many laps they do Barcelona, regardless of what Sebastian Vettel says about everybody's got to the limit of the car, I don't agree with that, because there's a massive amount of difference there, and it usually does add up to a tenth of a second. Maybe not a full tenth, but it certainly adds up to some time. And over a race distance, of course, that adds up to a lot of time. And it also adds up to what you're doing with the tyres and saving tyres, or overusing tyres as well. If you're doing one of these and you're loading the left rear going into the turn 3 with a lot of load on the car, you're doing a lot more, putting a lot more energy through the tyres. After that, turn 9, as I say, is a great corner, and I think it will have a big impact over the course of the weekend, because grip levels will change there, things will change. Obviously the tyre wear, the tyre temperature situation will change there, and there is that business of the car getting a little bit light and then just a driver being totally committed. It's a great corner, it's a lovely corner, and again you'll see it's difficult to see what a Lewis does there, but he does make the corner a little bit shorter than a Carlos Sainz would or a Romain Grosjean would. Sebastian Vettel there is probably sort of Valtteri Bottas territory, pretty conventional. And then the last bit, not my most favourite piece of road in terms of watching or whatever, or sympathising with the drivers, all that chicane. I don't know. I mean, I don't really understand that section of road either. It's all about curbs. It's all about what you do with the back end of the car to get it nice and straight for the exit. Probably a driver like Daniel Ricciardo is really good there, I would imagine. He's probably pretty good at curb manipulation through the last section of Barcelona. Speaking of which, interesting to see that Sebastian Vettel hit a curb hard enough at Silverstone, presumably during the race, actually to damage his chassis. So he's got a new chassis for the Spanish Grand Prix. It's not a big deal, but you don't hear about that very often. Nice of Ferrari to tell us. In the old days, of course, we'd like to know what chassis number it was. Dennis Jenkinson would, but we don't get that info anymore. It's impossible to get in the garage to look and see the chassis number, but that's another point. So yeah, new chassis for Seb Vettel this weekend, and probably he'll go quite well, and probably he'll say, look, you see, I told you that other chassis was hopeless. This new one, this shows me what I can do as a racing driver again. Just a prediction. See you over the weekend.